In this video, it's time to talk price changes and tariff news for Nintendo's US market. You see, while in Japan it's the spooky season around Oban in August, this year's news out of Nintendo might be just as horrific for the American market as the price changes for the original Switch and potential future price changes as a result of tariff negotiations for Switch 2 hove into view. Firstly, then, let's talk tariffs. The US Japan settlement for Japanese products entering America was 15%, although because tariffs are applied depending on the country of origin of the product and electronic goods are excluded, this might not have such an impact on most game purchases. US Vietnamese negotiations continue with a landing zone looking to be about 20%, the current rate and the standing negotiating position of the US, and 11%, which Bloomberg reports is what the Vietnamese negotiators were happy to accept. Let's assume that they settle in the middle and tariffs on Vietnamese electronic goods are also 15%, although currently they are 20%, and for a few months recently they have been 10%. This gives us a clearer picture of the costs and implications that might be facing Nintendo and ultimately their customers. Vietnam is really the only supplier that is likely to making Switch 2s for the US market. Of Nintendo's other two manufacturing bases, Cambodia's current US tariff rate of 36% is clearly unviable, and I won't even bother to discuss China. So Nintendo needs to make a choice based on the Vietnamese settlement. The tariff applies to the price at the time of import, so Nintendo does have a little bit of flexibility to absorb or mitigate costs, but let's just run the numbers on a 15% uplift across the board for both Vietnamese manufactured consoles and Japanese made games. If they applied a 15% uplift across the board, Switch 2 games and consoles, the Switch 2 would be $570.50, the Mario Kart World Bundle $575, Mario Kart World would be $92, Donkey Kong Bonanza $80, most Switch games $69, and Metroid Prime Remastered $46. For games, the get out of jail free card is that Nintendo can do what they've done in the past in many countries and run a slight concessionary rate for digital purchases, which is usually around a $10 saving or equivalent. They could even assemble and print cards in the US, but this might be a Pyrrhic victory if the costs involved with getting this up and running are greater than the tariffs themselves. Plus, they may be very reluctant to argue that the bulk of their games are made in the US and not in Japan, as would presumably be required to bypass tariff rules, which suggest the country where the bulk of the effort of creation has taken place as the country of origin, and therefore where the tariffs should be applied from. Therefore, I would suggest that if they make a shift of this nature, digital RRPs would likely remain static for games, but Mario Kart World would therefore move up to $90, Donkey Kong Bonanza to $80, new Switch titles to $70, and Metroid Prime Remastered to $50, all reflecting Nintendo's usual approach to try to stick to round number adjustments to their prices. The digital sales do have a higher margin, of course, so in theory, an uptick in digital sales could give them extra leeway to have a smaller change in the physical price points, but given that these are all in round figures anyway, I can't see this making a lot of difference. Consoles, on the other hand, well, I think it's time to talk about the price increase at the beginning of August for the original Switch set of systems. I did put out a video several months ago with the cheeky thumbnail, "I give it till August," about the Switch 2 pricing. My logic was that Nintendo would be able to ride out a certain amount of time based on consoles already imported, chiefly from Vietnam, before tariffs were imposed, but they needed to make a decision on whether to stick or twist on their pricing ahead of the holiday season, around or before their August financials, which also is roughly when they will have been running out of Switch 2s that were imported earlier. As it turned out, they decided to twist, but only for the original Switch. Switch is experiencing a 13% price jump to $340, Switch Lite a 15% price jump to $230, and Switch OLED a 14% price jump to $400. In many respects, this is smart. These older consoles are the ones with bigger margins, especially the earlier two, so in theory, these consoles will be able to absorb higher tariffs while keeping their prices relatively stable. But it's pointless at this stage in the life cycle of the Switch to make any particular effort to shield it from these necessary increases. I'd also guess that Nintendo are experiencing the effect of higher prices for these consoles sooner, since they evidently went all out to ensure a good supply of Switch 2 for the foreseeable future early on, but possibly didn't put the same effort into stockpiling Switches given their limited warehouse space. The upshot is that for Switch 2 they could absorb the price a little bit longer. This almost certainly means that they will be selling their machines at a loss in the US though, and I doubt that Nintendo will find this sustainable, which means that I do think that the Switch 2 will ultimately have to have differential pricing as well. Whatever settlements are reached, it's difficult to see the final arrangements going any lower than the 11% absolute floor the Vietnamese negotiators were pitching for, and so my 70% expectation is that Nintendo will raise the price of the base console by 11% to $500 by the end of the financial year, most likely in January after the major holiday season. This probably won't fully account for additional costs, of course, if tariffs are 15% or 20%, but will go some way towards mitigating them. And it's also why I thought, going back to my videos last year, that they would ideally want to hit that psychological barrier of $500, even if they used additional content such as, it turns out, Mario Kart World as a pack-in game to get there. I'm not saying anybody is going to be deliriously happy about a $500 price point for the Switch 2 console, but the fact that Nintendo already have had a $500 SKU, I think makes the change marginally easier to sell than if they were hitting the $5,000 mark fresh for the very first time. Having said that, there are other considerations that may affect how much leeway Nintendo has to operate. One difficulty they may find themselves facing is that their US supply chain has become much more brittle as a result of these changes. Whereas before they had supply lines from 3 major different nations, now they're likely to be relying on only one. Vietnam has had very major storms before, which have disrupted shipments, and so Nintendo will need to plan around these possibilities to a greater extent. This means having a good supply of consoles in hand and building their holiday season stock even earlier. That means more reliance on specific transport links and more warehouse space required potentially. However, Switch 2 boxes are about 7% smaller by volume than Switch OLED boxes, and if we assume that there will be a dip in the uptake of physical purchases of Nintendo games, then Nintendo can probably keep their existing warehousing arrangements and still absorb a good number of Switch 2s. Still, the need to stockpile machines in the US might mean that they are less nimble in fulfilling orders in other parts of the world. What about the impact of the price increases for sales of the original Switch lineup? For the many people keen to see the old console break records, it may seem like an impediment, but with a new console on the scene, Switch was always likely to trail off a little bit in terms of sales. I suspect this may expedite the point at which they retire one of the models, although which one they shunt off the scene first is trickier to determine. The 2017 original might seem logical, but it also has very high margins for them, whereas the newer OLED has relatively poor margins, as Shuntaro Furukawa has established many times. Then there's the Switch Lite, which is the lowest selling as it stands, but may have more resilience going forward as an entry point system for the Switch once the Switch 2 takes the spot at the top of the market of the main console system that Nintendo is selling. In certain respects, Nintendo might not have bothered raising the price if they were simply planning to discontinue supply too quickly, but on the flip side, they may have decided that they will make a big commitment to manufacturing and then discontinue 1 or 2 lines at the end of the financial year, leaving a big enough stockpile that they can dispense with gradually over the year or 2 ahead. However, irrespective of what happens with future tariff decisions, if they import all of these in the next few months, then they know they can shift them at a price that incorporates the tariffs as they were at the time of import. Nintendo knows that they can shift these consoles long term, and a small increase in price just means that if they pull the plug, their supply of systems will last a bit longer because the higher price will slightly dampen down demand. Other consoles have a roughly 60% drop off year on year. I'm thinking of the 3DS, DS, Wii, and so on. So I would expect Nintendo to need about 2 million for the 2026 to 2027 financial year, and maybe a million Switches for the 27 to 28 financial year, by which point we can expect a Switch 2 Lite, I imagine, which would probably limit continued interest in the Nintendo Switch, although I suspect it will have quite a long tail as people continue to want a cheaper entry point into Nintendo's Switch ecosystem. I think Nintendo may continue nursing the Switch along in various forms for quite a while, therefore, but I don't necessarily think they'll cut all three lines off at once. But axing, say, the OLED and the original model would give them a very competitive bottom of the market offer in the Switch Lite at $230, which will be significantly cheaper than any other console in the market in not too distant a future. As for the main console, things should get easier from here as parties zone in on settled positions for their tariff arrangements. Of course, tariffs tend to make trading relationships more febrile and could lead to more chopping and changing, especially as different administrations in different countries seek to renegotiate, but we can expect that sooner or later all Nintendo's competitors will be raising their prices commensurately. If Nintendo time it perfectly, as the frenzy of the early adopting crowd fizzles out, the arrival of new PlayStation and Microsoft consoles will make Switch 2 appear to be the affordable one in the crowd. Now, perhaps they won't get this timing completely right, but all the same, I think the existing strong demand for Switch 2 probably gives them enough elbow room that they need at the moment in order to continue the momentum of the Nintendo Switch family of systems. Thanks as ever for watching, and if you like the content, please consider sharing it around to reach more people. There's also some cool exclusive and early access stuff on the Patreon for those who are interested. Thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.